Um, Hello, everybody. So we are the second day of the main conference, and we are hosting the second keynote of the main program. And today I'm very happy to host Fausto Giunchiglia from Trento. So Fausto is a person who, well, too long CV to read everything, but let me say just couple of things which I know of Fausto. So Fausto is one, at least in my view, one of the people which really made computer science in Trento alive in the past 10 plus years, I would say, with amazing research track record. So he was, sorry. He was involved with many world-famous universities, including Genoa, Stanford, Edinburgh. So then IRST, later now these days FBK in Trento. Among others, he had 10 Best Paper Awards, 50 plus keynotes at the most impactful research events. He's on the editorial boards on many journals. He was, among others, also organizer of many big conferences, including ICHKAI, which is kind of sister conference to WWW, or the WEB conference, how we say these days. And he was also president of ICHKAI. And many more things, right? So Fausto really made a long way from theory to practice. He participated on, many EU projects and other research projects. So he really has, he saw web while it was building up in 90s, but also later everything what was kind of related to web and AI. So in that way, I'm really happy to that we have Fausto here. And Fausto, please start your talk. And the topic is kind of relevant for these days, as I see from the title and abstract, right? Fausto, please.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share the screen.
Works.
Okay, it works?
Works.
Perfect. So if you let me know if something breaks, otherwise I'll go on if you don't tell me anything or anything, okay?
Yeah.
So thanks everybody. Thanks, Marco. So I'm going to talk about a topic like diversity. I've been working on diversity since 2007. When I actually started my first European project on this topic. And I know that diversity in science and technology and AI is not much of a big word. And but I think that maybe today I'll be able to convince you that this is actually something to this notion that we can discuss about. And the way I'm going to do it is by relating diversity to bias, and instead bias is very much a very hot topic these days in the web. And then the relations of these online social relations by other related issues. Marco, please tell me when I am like half an hour in the talk and then 30 minutes in the talk, because okay, thank you, Marco. I hope you hear me. Okay, so briefly, so let me just put the web in perspective now. I'll just say something obvious, but I'm saying something obvious because sometimes we are in the middle of things happening and we just don't realize just because it is happening. So, but if I remember when I was like 10 years ago, I mean, we really transformed our lives. And I think the key real property that the web did is really that basically now as we're doing now, I mean, time and space, at least for communication, for interaction, content sharing, doesn't play any role. And we have zero-time connections. And of course, this really means that in zero time, you connect to anybody, even from very, very different cultures. So that's the magic of the web. Is that important? Yes, it is important. Why? Because pretty much we are connected to 7 billion people. And so, I mean, out of these 7 billion people, how much do we know? 1,000? 10,000? And basically all of them are very different for us. All of them are different from us, but some of them are really very different from us. We have no idea. And so this is what I mean by people diversity. I mean, in zero time, we can connect to anybody. Now, of course, we've always been like this, like, but as I usually say, like when we were in 1900, if you are Italian and you had never been to China, you didn't even to France, you could go to France. But you see, going to France would take like a month or a week or 2 weeks. While getting there, you get used to the place. You get used to the change in scenario, the change in environment, the change in language. Now you don't have that luxury anymore. You just get connected to anybody in zero time. So it's not only that there is a diversity, but diversity comes to you in zero time. Is that good? Of course that's good. Because diversity is really a feature that this one I'm going to be using many years for many talks. Is a source of opportunities. And let me say, because the diversity is a feature, is something that we use all the time, but we never really think about. So let me just give one example. I mean, even before the web, when we were felt sick, we would go to the doctor. I mean, why? Because the doctor knows something that we don't know. Why does he know? Because it's a different training. Maybe if you are, I don't know, from some place, you can go to Italy to get some good food. Why? Because they have a culture in cooking good food. Maybe they are better than many other things. None of us is perfect. None of us knows everything. But each of us, as a person, as a culture, as a collective, as a research group, we know something much better than others. And everything else literally, much worse than everybody else. So this is what people mean when they say the union is kind of the sum of the parts, which is really by connecting, we can do much more because we can use our strengths and connect with the strengths of the other. And so this is exactly why all of this is going on. This is actually why the web is so successful. I mean, this is why all the global platforms, the digital platforms, are so successful. So it's a given. But at the same time, we see that, by the way, it's the same. Like when you live, like 20 years ago, when you live in your own village, you will see something strange or a foreigner, different anything. You would wonder, this is different from me. And in particular, if it was unexpected, if it was unknown, if it was something that you didn't want, it would be something that would kind of worry you. At least you would say, wow, what is this guy doing around me? And so, and it's just the same now, and of course at scale. And by the way, you have no way to control this. And for instance, now you get a lot of news. So they call fake news. But who decided that the news is fake? Well, how do you know that the news is fake? I mean, like there are a lot of examples where you just now you are getting this unexpected, unknown diversity, and people can tell you it's a fake, or that something is a fake news, or something is unethical. But how do you know the people? Who is telling the truth? You see, the web, with all the advantages that gave us, the web gave one major disadvantage, which I believe is actually the main problem, the main source of many of the problems that we have now because of bias and everything, which is, I mean, when you go around in the real world, people talk to you, but you see them in their face physically. The physical connection transfers some kind of information that the web cannot transfer. So all these problems of being unable to judge, having a grip on what you're being told, which you already have in real life, in the web, just get amplified. So, and this is really one of the main problems. And what is the problem? The problem is that we don't know how to deal with it. And so now, even now in these times of COVID, we are now in this wonderful situation of the web giving us so much. Think of this conference. I mean, like 20 years ago, maybe we could have not done it in presence of COVID, but most likely we do not have the COVID either. So the issue is, how do we deal with this? And it's not that there is something bad or something good. As usually in life, there is both good and bad. But what is really true is that this is a major social challenge. And it's a very major social challenge that will change the way we shape not only the web and our research, the lives of people. So basically, this is the key idea. And my talk today, we're really going to talk a bit about some ideas that been working out this tension between diversity as a feature and diversity as a bug in the web. And so let me just spend, before getting to the more scientific part, but anyhow, I'm going to just give a talk more in kind of a general vision. Let me just go back to the notion of diversity, because people say, okay, what is diversity? Is that just being different? I mean, like, so what? At the same time, everybody, if you look to machine learning, everybody talks about similarity. Why did not people think about diversity? Everybody do, of course, we know why people talk about similarity, because when in machine learning, if you talk about similarity, you can learn about when people doing similar stuff, from similar behaviors, or from similar views of the same object, right? About diversity. So, okay, so diversity now comes into play, but just because, in a sense, in the past, even when you do machine learning, in a sense, you talk about similarity because you're in control of what you're going to get in input. But this is exactly why you need to talk about diversity. You are no longer in control of what you're getting in input. So what is similarity? I mean, I look at the dictionary, they say the condition of having or being composed of different elements. Okay, so being different, being diverse is that you have different elements. Differing, not differing. Yes, but then the issue is really, well, okay, what's the point? I mean, like, everything and everybody is different from everybody else. And by the way, I mean, we know how to do it. I mean, like, we have like properties in KR, you have like object properties, data properties. In machine learning, you have features. We know how to do this. We just describe people with certain properties, and therefore, what is the point? I mean, you're just telling us that we need to describe objects with properties. Well, here, despite all of these, there is something else, which is, okay, we all knew in the past how to describe objects with properties, but as I said before, all the examples that we had in the past when we were talking about diversity, first of all, the scope of diversity was controlled. You define the property, you define the object to be described, and then within everything different, you talk about similarity. Okay, so this fundamental issue of the being able to predict diversity is the key point to the web, and then I'll tell later the impact on bias. The first thing that you have to get next is that if you get out of the scenario where you are in charge, I mean, and you basically are in control of the kind of diversity you get in input, then this means now you move into an open scenario. In this open scenario, I mean, you just get what you get. And so now it's not that you decide what you want and then you decide what is similar. You just get what you get. And therefore, what happens, if you think what happens in the real life, is that what is different and what is similar is a social property. I mean, like, is a contextual property in particular, in the sense that, first of all, when you belong to a culture, like a European culture, most likely the notion of different is different from the notion of different in the Chinese culture and even in the US culture. And even within that, even for us being Europeans, in the sense having some kind of notions of diversity and similarity, even for us, we have another element of a complication, which is the notion of similarity is contextual. And let me give an example. I mean, if I need to do some job, like writing a paper, I mean, a woman and a man, like gender plays no role. What matters the competence. But at the same time, if I need to distinguish on some other jobs, maybe being a man or being a woman can make a difference. So the point here is really the notion of diverse. What is meant to be diverse from a practical point of view, from even a theoretical point of view, really depends on the task you're trying to choose. And this is exactly why all the time we just select people based on contextual defined properties. As I said, all of these we've done. The point of view is that so far, I mean, we were in control of the people we were measuring. We were in control of the phenomenon. We were in control of the kind of object we were classifying. And therefore, given that, we were in control of what to be expected, what to be unexpected, how to measure the dimension, how to measure diversity and similarity. Because remember, even if in the past we thought of measuring only similarity because we did not need to measure diversity, I mean, all the time we had to define the metrics. And as we all know, like in the web, we do have a huge problem with data integration or data semantic heterogeneity, is that according to different purposes, you have different metrics and so on. So, but the bottom line here is that in all of this, I mean, there is a huge social and contextual dimension to be diverse or similar. So, okay, so now that we have said this, the next step is, okay, let's move on. So, the next point of view is that, okay, we're talking about diversity, but, okay, the bottom line is that we did in this project look at this various work in the social sciences, and actually these guys introduced two types of diversity. The first one, the type called inessential diversity, and in the social sciences, they call it observable surface diversity, and it involves topics like religion, race, ethnicity, national origin, demographics, culture, age. Let me make the rationale behind this. When these original work that we did from the social sciences, the problem that these guys had was human resources. So the point was that they did notice that with the globalization of the economy and the internationalization of companies, they would get a lot of mixed people in working together, different, not only different gender, but different cultures, different language, different everything. And then they were wondering what was the impact of diversity on performance. And this again when they said, okay, there's a form of inessential diversity, and inessential diversity is this kind of examples, where basically the key idea is that the diversity that you see superficially. I mean, you can superficially see whether someone is a woman. You can superficially approximate the age. But they said that there is also something that they call essential diversities, which they said would be less observable, deep level. And what is the key difference? Because if national diversity is about how you look, essential diversity is about what you know how to do, your skills. I mean, for instance, plumbing, you know how to be this exactly, or knowing medicine, or knowing English, or knowing AI. So what is the key idea? That if in the first type of diversity, you distinguish people and things and objects based on how they look, in the essential, you differentiate people and things by how they do. And by the way, if you read the two lists, you find out that in both lists you have demographics, culture, and age, which is not that there is something which is inherently essential, is something inherently essential. Let me give an example of age. Okay, if you judge me by age just because you look at me, then it's inessential. But if you judge me by age because you know that I'm old and therefore you have a lot of experience, and because of that you can trust me in something, for instance, because of that experience, then it is essential. So you see, the bottom line here is that, of course, everything is diverse, but there's something looking different and there's something being different. And now these two issues go together. It's not that you can choose one. The point of all these messages, depending on how you look at them, you're going to just do different things, and your follow-up decisions are going to be different. And by the way, interesting enough, this work in sociology that was followed up by other work in other disciplines said, of course, in essential diversity, the kind of diversity that in the working community would come first. At the beginning, people were just judge you because of your inessential diversity. Then the more people knew to other people, the more time got into coming in, the more people judge other people into essential diversity. And by the way, they also showed this result that a posteriori is obvious, but that anyhow is a major result, which is, and by the way, what really matters to get things done is essential diversity. I mean, it matters. The age is irrelevant for how you look. Age is irrelevant for what you do. All of this was the bottom line. So basically, pretty much. And then, of course, what I'm also adding here is that essential diversity. I remember my example I gave you at the beginning of going to the doctor, is what we really exploit. While inessential diversity is really what we sometimes escape. So this is really real life, right? Now, going back to the web is the same. So in the web, we just got for free Facebook, WhatsApp, everything, all the platform, eBay, Amazon, whatever. All of this for free was a given, no cost. But then all of a sudden we woke up later on and we said, oh, wait a moment. All this kind of connectivity, we do have problems. Oh, there are fake news, there is unethical behavior, so on and so forth. At scale, and that's a real novelty. At scale in zero-time connection. And what is the bottom line is, as I said at the beginning, this kind of scale is something that we do not know how to deal with. So this is the perspective. So my perspective, I'm really looking into talk about diversity in the web, and I'm trying to give some kind of unifying perspective. I'm going to do this through the work that we've done in 2 European projects. One called CICAT, that coordinate with the University of Cyprus, where I really look at bias, superficial diversity, transparency, which is, what we all know, which is also now with panel in the web, which is what I would describe the effects on the web of superficial diversity and the inessential diversity. And the other one that is coordinated by myself, which is WENet, the Internet of Us, that is about essential diversity, which is in the bottom line of the question here is, okay, we are now connected to the web. What is the next step up? Which is the next step moving from here to exploit the amazing opportunities that the web is giving us. By the way, just this year we wrote 2 or 3 papers, and you can find them, I guess. So if you can get the data from, if you're interested, otherwise you can just send me email anyhow. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about the big 3. My rest of the talk, I'm going to briefly talk about inessential diversity, and I'm going to take this opportunity to put bias in the perspective of diversity. Why so? Because I must say that sometimes I don't understand a lot of work on bias. I think I read a few hundred papers on bias, and I sometimes fail to understand the underlying rationale, and maybe being wrong, but in this work that we've done as part of CICAT, I try to put my own structure on how to think about bias. Of course, being fully aware that I can be biased like everybody else. So then the second part of my talk, I'm going to really say, okay, suppose that we're learning how to do and handle the essential diversity, how we can exploit essential diversity. Then I'm going to sum up. But let me just go to the first one, and diversity and bias. So this is really, I really decided to start from this topic. While I consider essential diversity much more important, as I said, we all take it for granted. And while we all talk about inessential diversity, so I thought, okay, let's start from describing inessential diversity. To put things on the right foot, maybe to free our mind from some correct concerns that we all have for what's going on in the web. So I just, as I usually do, I take the info from Wikipedia, and so I got bias as defined as follows. So Wikipedia says bias is a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. People may develop biases for or against an individual, a group, or a belief. And by the way, pretty much, in the papers I've written on bias, on fairness, transparency, and so on, pretty much this is a pretty consistent definition of bias. And so this is my starting point. So my observation is really that, okay, we read it, and as many other researchers, I find it pretty clear and commonsensical. It makes sense, right? And but when you think about it, pretty much coming from my diversity-oriented mind is, okay, so, but who decides what is close-minded? Who decides prejudicial? Who decides is unfair, right? I mean, who is in charge? Is that the strongest economist, the strongest researcher, the most famous, most successful expert professor? Who decides? That's not a minor detail. And it's a detail that sometimes is taken for granted. Who decides what is disproportionate? And by the way, assuming that someone decides, I mean, for instance, when we decide that something is needed, like as like Western culture, we agree with like for instance, like in natural language, when we got the notion of language, do we agree with the people talking minority languages? So, I mean, the point of who is charged of the discussion, because as I said, let me just repeat what I said before. So far in the past, the kind of the word was a given, but the web really opening up. And when you open up and the new diversity comes in, the issue of who decides, how to decide, is a key point. So in order to handle this issue, I look into the issue, how do you, by reading a bunch of papers, we look into various papers, and we were really trying to rationally reconstruct from the quote I gave you before, but also we gave a look at like hundreds of paper literature, literally. So first of all, how do you build bias? First of all, there is someone, the observer. I mean, there's always an observer, but in the bias, the observer actually plays a key role. And this observer is always associated with a reference point of view, and usually the observer comes in with a set of evaluation criteria and measures for these criteria. So, of course, as an observer, we all are humans. We come in and we have our own frame of mind. And what do we do then? We select the target phenomenon, right? Is that important? Of course. Do you judge me about being good when I did something good or when I did something bad? And then you observe the selected phenomenon. And then by observing, I mean, you, as I said before, you just introduce those kind of features or properties, when I want to call them, which makes you choose which parameters you use to model the phenomenon. And by the way, of course, this is not there's a choice there. And then, based on that, you look, now you have done this kind of modeling, you have described the phenomenon, and then you do the evaluation. And then, of course, at the end, the bias is a value judgment. And then at the end, you say, this is good, this is bad. And just based on the description that you built. Let me say, as I said, we do this always in life. But with the web, the key point is that most of the time, 99.9999% of the point, we don't get to see the phenomenon ourselves. So we always and only get to see the phenomenon through the observations, through the data given by developed by third parties. So we don't get, even by looking at the phenomenon ourselves, we will be in a sense, we take our own perspective, in a sense we'll be biased, but in the web, we just are not given that opportunity. And as I said, this is good, but this is actually why so many problems, in particular bias to me, is really becoming a big issue in the web. So let me give a concrete example to see what I mean, right? So this is a toy example that I built, I opened. I was trying to be non-controversial. I did not mean to be controversial in any sense. So, and okay, I said I took observe a South European vegan developer. I should have said Italian, but I put South European to be a little more general. You understand later why I put South European. So there's an observer, and this guy is a developer. So he just it does AI, it does machine learning. And by the way, this guy turns out to develop a machine learning algorithm trained on a data set coming from Mongolian. And by the way, this algorithm should be really used to classify food, types of food, and to define whether food is good or bad, healthy, and so on. And then, of course, what you do, now you get the algorithm test on the South European data set, because, see, I get data set from somewhere, I have no idea where the data set is come. I mean, of course, people have done it. I'm sure they've done for their best, but I don't really know. But by default, we assume that people are in good faith. So, okay, so I get the data set, and then I train, and then I applied it. And of course, sure enough, I'm going to get some unexpected results. Why? Because, you see, in Mongolian, the cuisine is meat intensive. And it's meat intensive for a reason. This is exactly why they put South European, because in South of Europe, the weather is good. I mean, Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar is the capital of Mongolia, is the capital with the coldest weather in the world. And of course, in those places, I mean, vegetables, I mean, what would make the main elements of a vegan person or someone interested in vegan food, I mean, are kind of hard to get. And most likely, this person, without knowing that the data set came from Mongolia, we say, okay, this is biased, this is kind of old-fashioned. I mean, I remember when I was young, I would eat a lot of meat, and now I don't eat meat anymore, but it's been 50 years in between, and a lot of technology in developing food and vegetables. So, and by the way, I've done this for the algorithm, and I suppose that to do exactly the same, but if you change ML algorithm trained on the data set with local expert, if you go through the example, you'll find out that nothing changed. No matter whether you're judging a person, no matter whether you're judging an algorithm, no matter whether you're judging a data set, all this issue of the point that the non-coherence very often of a source of data and the use of the data is really pervasive. By the way, this is the first example. Let me go for the second example. And the second example is just the opposite. So we have a Mongolian developer. The Mongolian developers to do an algorithm, trains, gets the data from the south of Europe, and test out the South European data sets. And again, the evaluation far from a reference point, because most likely this data set built by a vegan person for its own purpose would be like somewhat more intensive of vegetables for good reasons. And what would be the answer? Maybe this guy would not say this is really biased, but I would say, I'm assuming that this guy, of course, I'm not trying to be controversial just for the sake of the argument. Most likely, if I never been from Mongolia, okay, what's the point? I mean, like, we eat meat, right? And so, and again, if you change ML algorithm training on the data set with local expert, nothing changes. So what is the point? The clear point here, we call it bias, and then I could have talked about gender, race, religion, whatever, would have been the same. As I said, I was trying to be as non-controversial as possible, and by the same time as realistic as possible. Why have I been trying to be as controversial, as little controversial as possible? Why? Because as I found out in some experiments we did, when we get into really kind of issues which matter a lot to people, I mean, it's very hard to really take this kind of detached perspective that I'm trying to take, which is let's analyze how bias is constructed without getting into the value judgment, without getting involved us as a person in what we think is right or wrong. And I do believe that pretty much this description that I've given gives a fair account of what's going on. And also, I do believe that it does apply to everything, even to those type of bias and that make some of us very heated, and rightly so. I mean, I'm not pretending to say that is wrong and involved. So, summing up, what have we learned? First of all, for how I wrote it, both the South European vegan developer and the Mongolian meat eater and developer are well-minded. They're just trying to do their own work, but they just live in their own. They just live in their own country. they just live in their own context. They just live in their own social context, and given their own social context, they do have to find and solve their own problem. And in principle, in words, the problem is the same, like to get some algorithm which would allow to classify, describe, like dishes, food. But even if the task is exactly the same, the contextual and social dimension in practice makes it hugely different. Because when we boil down to experience, when you boil down to what is the subject matter, what you boil down to what is important for people, then South Europe and Mongolia are very different. Both great, both fine, but different. So, and this diversity is not on superficial stuff. It's really on fundamental issues like the availability or non-availability or certain food, or the possibility of doing or not doing certain things. So the point here is, what do we do next? So my argument, the argument that we are doing in our project is, maybe if you really understand this difference between inessential diversity and essential diversity, there is a missing two there, then most likely, if you are the South European vegan developer, when you get to this data set and the algorithm doesn't work, maybe you say, wait a moment, maybe the algorithm is wrong, maybe the data set is wrong, or maybe the data set was built under certain assumptions that do not apply to me. Or maybe they apply to me, but they do not apply to me in the way I thought. And so when you get into the step, then you go into ask yourself, okay, good. I have this kind of evidence of this kind of diversity that I would call essential diversity, superficial diversity. Okay, let's look into it. And maybe in the end, maybe there is a diversity for real, and then the diversity for real, I may agree with that diversity, I may disagree, I may like it, I may not like it, or maybe after all, when we get rid of the kind of the superficial features, they may be more similar than we think. So, in this case, my argument would be that if something that may be in the first phase could be raised bias, as I said in my first example, it could be, first of all, transform itself into a perception of diversity, and this diversity that now we understand better. Now, once you become aware of the diversity, at that point, it's still okay. I think it is fine to go and discuss about bias, whether you like it or you don't like it, whether you think it's right or wrong, whether you think it is disproportionate, and so on and so forth. But at least this kind of biased judgment comes after having put things in perspective. So, at that point, as I wrote, at this point, both the South European vegan and the Mongolian meat eater will decide whether they want to use the data set. Maybe the South European vegan would find that some kind of food can be good, and vice versa. So this is a key point. You see, there is a process of trying to recover the foundations, the reasons why we get certain phenomena that at the beginning we consider as biased. And the question, of course, here is, okay, all of this, can we do it? Can we implement this process on the web? Because clearly, all of this, as I said, is about people and interacting the web. I mean, the South European vegan and the Mongolian, most likely they don't know each other. They have not talked to one another. So the point here is, can we do this? How can we automate this process? Why so? Because I think that, as I going back to what I said at the beginning, if we're able to do something like this, we could put the discussion on bias, on diversity, on transparency, on fairness, on whatever you want, on a much more solid footage. Let me say that sometimes when I read a lot of papers about bias and diversity and fairness, I'm wondering how much the fairness is just the fairness of the author of the paper, how much of the bias judged by the author of the paper. I mean, the bottom line, I'm saying that when judging bias, you have to be very careful not being biased yourself. It's okay for you to be biased. That's fine. We are all biased up to a point, no matter where you work. But putting things in perspective does allow even you, in your own beliefs, in what you think is right or wrong, what you think is correct or not correct, to put your argumentation in much more solid footing. And I think it's really fundamental in the web, just because, as I said, I mean, if I'm European, I need to explain my own reasons. When I talk to a European, it's much easier than explaining to a Chinese, or even to an American, or even to a Mongolian. So in this globalized world, the issue of verifying the diversity as a foundation for any type of discussion, any type of data sharing, any type of argument sharing, I think is foundational and fundamental. And this is really the main. And why so? Because, and I'm just arguing, in this one slide, just says what I said before. If you look at what I wrote in my slides, when I said by, I said, who decides? Who decides? When I wrote about diversity, I said, what is? What are? So, I mean, pretty much the question is similar. I mean, the subject matter is similar, but the question is different in the sense that in a diversity approach, you really try to disconnect you from the decision. Even if you know that you cannot do this, I know that I can't get out of myself. Still, if I do this example of this problem, really asking what is instead of who decides, I think it gets less personal. It gets more objective. So they are very similar, and by the bottom line, not only that they are very similar, but it also seems that I mean, this of course is driven from how I wrote it. If you read, so this diversity, my own notion of diversity, and this bias is my own notion of bias. So again, you can tell me I'm biased, that's fine. But given this definition, and I hope to convince you that at least I'm in good faith by doing this. I'm not trying to convince anybody or cheating or anything. And I keep saying this because this is something you have to defend all the time when you're, I mean, I don't know who I'm talking. I don't know who is on the other side. So, I mean, I don't know what you're thinking. That's perfectly fine that you think whatever you want. But my point, I'm saying that I'm really trying to really put things in perspective. And then when I wrote diversity in this way, I'm saying I put it in a way so that the way I wrote it is so that it's more amenable to make it into an algorithm, right? And if you tell me the bias and diversity are the same thing, I'm fine. I mean, I'm not really here playing a religion word. I'm just trying to put things in perspective. But assuming the notion of diversity, and I'm assuming the notion of bias, then I've described in this paper that we just did, and this step is really to see how you could put bias in perspective, exactly to automate this process of really understand the process by which someone comes to think that something is biased. So we define a diversity space, and of course, this is what you do in machine learning, right? You define your features. By the way, one key point is that you define the origin. You define for yourself what is normal, right? What is normal would be something that would be the similarity to normal, mean that the similarity to what is in the origin is what you consider normal, acceptable. And then, of course, you have a notion of distance. I mean, you all know about the notion of distances. And then you can measure the deviation from the expected behavior. Notice that here, we're not looking for similarity. We're just trying to position the evaluation space within which we can do whatever we want in terms of similarity and everything. And then the key point here is coming with the shift from diversity space. Because you see, if you take in my notion of diversity, my notion of bias, if you take the phenomenon, the diversity space defines the space within which you evaluate, but then bias is within this space are some subspaces which to me are biased or not acceptable, or like bias in positive, bias in negative, doesn't matter. So it's like saying certain areas for certain value is acceptable, is very different, but when you go beyond that point or that area, I mean, diversity becomes biased just because I think that your perspective plays a role which goes beyond diversity. So the point here is that really notice that while the step from 1 to 2 namely building diversity space, is driven by the problem modeling. The step into bias does get you into the value judgment of whether something is biased or not. And this, I think, is the one major difference between diversity and bias. And this is why I think that diversity is a good way to approach bias. I'm not saying that at all, of course, given a value judgment is bad or good. I do believe, however, that if you want to do that, to put them in the perspective of a reference space is better. And because of this, we build this notion of transparency path. What is the transparency path? It's just the step by which diversity is defined. We call it diversity transparency path. What is? You just say explicitly with the formula that you're modeling. Then you tell me explicitly what are the properties you chose and why. You tell me the metrics. You select the normality. You do the measuring. Right. By the way, all of these we are already doing. Right? It's not that we're not doing it. I'm just saying that for instance, in my example of the data set, if you, the Mongolian developer, were making available his own or her own data set to make available this metadata, maybe it would have made it easier for the South European to understand the sources of the unexpected behavior and vice versa. Once I've done it, then the transparency path is just the next step, which is, okay, given all this measure of diversity, this is acceptable, this isn't acceptable, this is biased, this is not biased. So you see, and you see, we are back to square one, where we are trying really to put things in perspective and get into, let me say, more computation amenable notion of diversity and bias. Some observations? They gave me, yeah?
For 5 more minutes.
Okay, right. So the real more meaning here is really that we are really going into transparency paths, which is really the one way to really go from inessential to essential transparency, putting things in perspective. And then, of course, rightly so, each of us will decide why we think is correct. So this pretty much is this experiment. And with this experiment, I will just describe what we did. We set up this framework, and we did ask. We asked a bunch of computer scientists. We did a little experiment to see how this would work. And over a period of like 1 month, we met 5 weeks. 5 times, once a week, and we did the exercise. We chose some pictures. Why pictures? Because pictures are much more direct representation of the world than words. And then we did the experiment, and we did exactly the transparency path. By the way, this is written in this one paper that I've quoted. And so the question was: can the inherent diversity in a data set used to represent a phenomenon in the world become a source of bias? All of them said yes. And all of them said at the end that the way to avoid bias, or at least to avoid or to diminish the perception of bias, was to really make the user themselves aware of the alternative views. I mean, to put things in perspective. And then 2 of them said that one data set was from Google, and the other data set was from a very nice site which takes pictures about all over the world, including like poor countries. And they said that in particular the Google data set was the unequal distribution of representations of cases in the data set. And clearly, I mean, and by the way, it's not that Google is doing it on purpose or anything. It's that if you're not very careful in controlling the way you generate the data set, which is your representation of the phenomenon, by definition, even without wanting it, you introduce bias. And then, of course, one participant referred to the definition of bias as being context dependent. And so, we asked the participants, what do you think? So first of all, they said bias is never individual. Our choices are socially constructed. This is what bias is so convincing. They said, yes, okay, but bias when it is personal, real bias. And then they said in this experiment, we should bring this notion of bias, which is the value of judgment based on some kind of agreement, which is socially agreed upon. Then it said, oh yes, because we asked them, we give them this amazing number of like millions of photos from Google and for this other site. We told them, choose your own photos. And then we asked them, why did you choose a photo? Remember step number 2. And all of them had different reasons, all very good reasons. All very good, but they were very different. Why? Because they were biased by their own perspective. They were biased by their own goals. And they said, oh, by the way, this is the same way we build bias into the data set without wanting it. Maybe this is generally the case. So these are probably biased data sets are built. And then the last part is really, again, can it be, the last question was, can we build this into AI program? And like, can we really automate this process? And is that worthwhile? Can do this? And the answer was somewhat yes. And the bottom line, I underlined the last point I'm going to read. Any data set aimed at visual depictions of the world phenomena that would create would be somehow biased. And of course, mean that it embodies the assumptions of the developer. So that was the first result. Now I just want to say 2 words. The only point I'm saying, if the point here is, and then I'm going to stop here because I'm going to go to the question is 1-2 words about, okay, suppose that we can trace bias. Suppose that we can trace diversity. Suppose that I can set up a system by which I build the system, the ability to maximize the probability that will tell me something, even if I don't know you, I have a good probability of understanding you, even if you're from a different culture, even if you're totally different. Well, is that good? Yes, it could, because this is actually what we do in this other WENET project I don't have time to talk about now, which is empowering diversity-aware social relations. And the key point here is, can we build a system where we create a platform connecting people, including unknown people? Remember at the beginning I said the unknowns? Where the goal goes as follows. I have a need, and because I have this need, I ask for help, and then someone provides me an answer. And first of all, it must be the right person. Second of all, I must be able to trust this person. Can we do this? How we do this? Anyhow, this is what we are working on. This is a project. I'm going to give 2 more slides and I'm shutting up. And by the way, I want to say 2 more things. This is the project. It's experiment driven. We collect real data. We have as users students because it's easier, but we have like students from like all over the world. We just collect data. We collect data using sensors, using questions, and so on and so forth. And we're really studying the diversity of people, the diversity of behaviors, and we're really looking into the data we get. And then we see, we're going to just model the diversity of people, and then based on that, we're going to trace the diversity to get to the bias, as I said before. So to give an example, in the last experiment, which lasted 3 months, we collected data from 6,000 students all over the world. You see the countries where we collect data. In Europe was Copenhagen, Trent, of course, and London, and then India, Mongolia, and so on, and South America, now collecting the data in Mexico and China. Because the point here is interesting that in this globalized world, of course, we all have the data by the web, about the web, of course, we have a lot of them. But when we go to data about real people, trying to model the diversity of people, there are no data. So this is what we are doing. To close up my slide, my talk, let me just go to the beginning, to the end, I'm sorry. And of course, I could have spent more time if I wasn't late and lazy in my presentation into discussing how we do this. But anyway, you can find the data online. So what's next? Where am I? I'm also finished, Marco. So these are what I'm saying, the web in perspective. And once upon a time, there were enterprise systems. Then there was the web of data. This is exactly what we tried to solve when we were doing semantic web. Like we had a lot of heterogeneity in the data. The future to me is a web of people. And let me just read, and then this is the last thing I'm going to say. The solution to me for the future, at least for me, is the key to the future is what they call human-centric AI, which, by the way, in Europe is a very hot topic these days. And the way I describe it, the way we work in the WEB project is a move from a network of computers, which in turn may be connected to people, to a diversity-aware network of people whose interactions are mediated and powered by computers. And that's it, which is instead of really concentrate on the data, we really concentrate on people, the diversity of people, and we see whether by tracing diversity, exploiting diversity, minimizing the negative effects of the web, we can actually build systems which is the next generation web, which will enable online social relations. Thank you, and sorry for being maybe too long.
Well, Fausto, thanks very much. Maybe we have just time for maybe one or two quick questions. So now at the end, you mentioned the efforts, not just in Europe, but also at the level of international organizations and so on, to regulate AI. And one of the most typical topics which appears in these recommendations and the upcoming treaties, right, is human-centered AI, which is based on many things, but the word bias appears over and over. Now, I'm involved in OECD, in Council of Europe, UNESCO, and so on. And so what I'm missing in these discussions often is exactly this structured view as you provided. So my quick question to you would be, what would be your advice based on all the experience you collected and all the thoughts you had on this? What would be your recommendation to this, let's say, these international organizations for these upcoming documents? How to address bias in a proper way, so that on one side lawyers would be happy, policymakers would be happy, and researchers and technologists would be happy. Could you, I mean, it's an easy question, right? But could you provide maybe a little bit of guidance on that front?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that bias is the effect, is not the cause. Diversity is the cause. Bias is the cause, as well as all the good things we get from the web. Bias is the effect, as well as all the good things we get from the web, like platforms. So from my point of view, the way to do this is really to understand diversity, model diversity, and this is something we've been doing now for like 2.5 years in this project, and then to talk about bias and positive features. And I do believe that it is wrong to consider bias by itself. I think bias has to be put in perspective and confronted and compared with advantages. I mean, I'm not pretending that you have to give up your value judgment for everything, but I think that there is a trade-off. Once you have diversity, then you really should put your understanding how you deal with the positive things and the negative things of the web and the AI together. And this is really, to me, the fundamental way to go. And of course, it would have to be done in a systematic and procedural way. And let me give another example. Everybody talks about privacy. But as I usually say, that's another example, which is exactly the same. But in a globalized world, suppose that now in Beijing, and suppose that all the time I fall in the street and nobody I know is around me. I mean, suppose that I suffer from diabetes. I mean, diabetes is a disease, so I don't want anybody to know. By that one specific case, I would want just the person near me to know. So why I believe it is wrong to give up all your privacy in advance, as happens now. There is a trade-off between privacy and transparency. Privacy and transparency, the same way there is between pros and cons in the bias. This, I think, the way to do it. There is a trade-off. That's the way to really live in a globalized, open world.
Yeah. Thanks. I think we will have to finish because we are 1 minute over, and all the sessions are starting now at 10. So, Fausto, thanks again for this, I think, very insightful talk. I think the topic is, let's say, hot and relevant, especially in perspective of what's happening these days. And next week, this big European document on AI is coming, which is addressing these issues as well. So I think the topic will be discussed more in the future, but this insight, I think, is very valuable. So at this point, I would just say thanks, and we'll pass the control of the screens to the rest of the team so that the 5-6 parallel sessions will start now. Thanks, Fausto.
Thank you very much. And sorry for being long.
No. This is, it's welcome, Thanks again.
Thank